Well, it is all over for the grifters of Oz. So long, farewell, Meghan, or just call me Meg, as she apparently likes to go by, and her spare handbag, Harry, have finally left Australia after a whirlwind circus.
A shocking turn of events is capturing global attention as Prince Harry finds himself at the center of an uncomfortable and highly public moment. During a recent appearance in Australia, reactions toward Meghan Markle have sparked intense debate, with many interpreting the response as a clear and unexpected rejection. As cameras rolled and headlines spread, the situation quickly escalated into a wave of scrutiny and speculation. So, what truly unfolded during this visit? And why is it being seen as such a defining and deeply embarrassing moment for Harry? And what do you think really happened behind the scenes? And what does it reveal about their global standing now? Drop your comment below and subscribe as we uncover the hidden truths others won't tell. When the silence spoke louder than the crowd. From the very first public appearance, something felt unmistakably wrong. This was meant to be a high-profile return, the kind that draws attention, admiration, and large, eager crowds. Instead, when Prince Harry stepped out alongside Meghan Markle in Australia, the atmosphere told a completely different story, one that no one had fully anticipated. The signs of expectation were everywhere. Barriers had been carefully arranged along the streets, stretching far beyond what the moment seemed to require. Security presence suggested preparation for a significant turnout. It looked, at first glance, like the setup for something major. But as the cameras rolled and the couple moved through these spaces, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The open areas behind those barriers remained largely empty. Where there should have been excitement and movement, there was stillness. It wasn't just a matter of smaller crowds than expected. It was the absence of energy. The few people present appeared scattered, unengaged, and in some cases, simply passing through. There were no waves of enthusiasm, no visible surge of support, just pockets of quiet observation that felt detached from the moment itself. The scene created an unsettling imbalance between what had been planned and what was actually unfolding in real time. Observers began to notice subtle shifts in body language. Prince Harry, once so familiar with large, responsive audiences, seemed momentarily unsure of how to navigate the unexpected calm. His expressions hinted at confusion, as though trying to reconcile the silence with what he might have anticipated. The usual rhythm of public engagements, greeting crowds, responding to cheers, feeding off visible energy, was noticeably disrupted. Without that feedback, every movement felt more exposed, more uncertain. Meghan Markle maintained her composure, but even that couldn't fully bridge the growing gap between presentation and perception. The setting had all the elements of importance, yet something essential was missing. The moment didn't feel rejected in a loud or aggressive way. There were no protests, no dramatic confrontations, no overt hostility. Instead, what unfolded was far more difficult to confront. It was indifference. That quiet, almost invisible response carried a weight that no criticism could match. Because indifference doesn't argue, it doesn't engage, it simply withdraws. And in that withdrawal, it leaves behind a silence that speaks volumes. The carefully prepared environment, the extended barriers, the expectation of attention, all of it stood in stark contrast to the reality that unfolded. As the appearances continued, the pattern became harder to dismiss as a coincidence. The gap between expectation and reality didn't close, it widened. And with each passing moment, it became clearer that this was not just an isolated miscalculation. It was something deeper, something more revealing about how the visit was being received, not with outrage, not with excitement, but with a quiet distance that could not be easily explained away. As appearances continued, coincidence was no longer believable. Expectation and reality drifted further apart, revealing something deeper, a quiet, unexplained distance shaping how the visit was received, not with outrage or excitement, but unsettling silence. What was really happening behind the fading spotlight? What is missing? Stay glued. The high price of a fading spotlight. As the quiet uncertainty of their public appearances lingered, attention quickly shifted to what was meant to be the centerpiece of their visit. In Sydney, an exclusive event had been carefully positioned as a premium experience, promising something intimate, inspiring, and deeply personal. It was held at the Intercontinental Coogee Beach, a five-star setting known for its sweeping ocean views and polished luxury. On paper, everything about it suggested success. The location was impressive, the branding was confident, and the pricing signaled exclusivity. Tickets began at 2,699 Australian dollars and rose beyond 3,200 for those seeking a more elevated experience. The message was clear. This was not just an event, it was a rare opportunity to connect with Meghan Markle in a meaningful way. Expectations were carefully shaped around transformation, access, and inspiration. But as guests arrived and the event unfolded, a different reality began to take shape. The turnout told its own story. Instead of the hundreds that might have been expected for such a high-profile gathering, the numbers were strikingly low. The room, designed to feel exclusive, instead felt underfilled. Tables remained partially occupied, with some seats left untouched. The atmosphere lacked the vibrant energy that typically accompanies events of this scale and cost. What should have felt intimate instead leaned toward uncomfortable, as the gap between expectation and reality became harder to ignore. When Meghan finally appeared, the moment carried a sense of anticipation, but it did not last long. Her presence was brief. She participated in a question-and-answer session, speaking for a limited period before leaving earlier than many had anticipated. The schedule, which had been framed as a full immersive experience, unfolded more like a short appearance. For those who had invested significant time, money, and hope into the event, the experience felt incomplete. There were strict controls in place. Photography was not permitted. Filming was restricted. Security was visible and active, adding another layer of distance between the attendees and the moment they had paid to be part of. Even opportunities for closer interaction came with additional costs, creating an experience that felt structured and limited rather than open and engaging. For many in the room, the emotional shift was subtle but undeniable. Excitement gave way to confusion. Confusion gradually turned into disappointment. The promise of connection did not fully materialize, and the sense of exclusivity began to feel less like privilege and more like restriction. Conversations that followed reflected a shared feeling that something had not lived up to what had been offered. What stood out most was not simply the low attendance or the shortened appearance. It was what those details suggested beneath the surface. The pricing had aimed to position the event as highly desirable, yet the response hinted at something changing. The demand that once seemed guaranteed no longer appeared as strong or as certain. As the event came to an end, the contrast between the polished image that had been presented and the experience that unfolded remained difficult to ignore. What was designed to reinforce influence and connection instead raised quite questions about reach, relevance, and how the public was beginning to respond in ways that were far less enthusiastic than before. As the event concluded, the polished image carefully projected clashed with the reality experienced, exposing subtle cracks in influence, relevance, and public connection. As enthusiasm quietly faded and doubt began to spread across observers and supporters alike, was this the turning point no one expected? Stay tuned. A nation that chose not to respond. What unfolded inside the Sydney event soon began to ripple outward, extending far beyond the carefully prepared venue and into the surrounding streets, where the real measure of public response quietly revealed itself. As Prince Harry and Meghan Markle moved through Sydney, the pattern that had started to emerge at the event itself became increasingly visible in real time, and far more difficult to ignore the closer they came to the public eye. Public appearances that would normally generate anticipation, movement, and spontaneous gathering instead passed with an unusual stillness. Streets that had been mapped out with expectation felt strangely open, almost underoccupied, as though the moment itself had not fully translated into public engagement. There was presence, but not participation, visibility, but not energy. The visual contrast was difficult to miss. Barricades lined key routes with precision, placed in anticipation of dense crowds that never fully materialized. Security teams remained alert and positioned as though expecting surges of movement that simply did not occur. The infrastructure of a major public reception had been fully activated, yet the human response did not match the scale of preparation behind it. A handful of individuals stood scattered along barriers, some pausing briefly, others continuing their day without hesitation. There was no collective buildup, no expanding wave of attention, no shared emotional peak forming in the space. This quiet response carried a different kind of weight, subtle but persistent. It did not resemble rejection in any direct or confrontational sense. There were no raised voices, no visible protest, no organized resistance to the visit. Instead, what emerged was something far more understated and arguably more difficult to interpret: absence. Not hostility, but distance. Not opposition, but disengagement. For those observing closely, the comparison to earlier public appearances in similar contexts became unavoidable. There had been moments in the past when such visits naturally drew significant crowds, with enthusiasm translating into visible presence and collective energy. In those instances, anticipation alone seemed enough to shape the atmosphere of the streets. Now, however, that sense of immediacy felt noticeably reduced. The difference was not only in numbers, but in emotional tone. Where there had once been excitement, there was now restraint. Where there had once been connection, there was now a quiet separation between expectation and reality. Media coverage began to reflect this shift with careful, measured language. Rather than focusing on controversy or dramatic backlash, reports pointed instead to something more subdued and observational. The emphasis was not on what had gone wrong, but on what had not occurred. The crowds had not turned hostile. They had simply not appeared in the way that tradition or expectation might have suggested. That distinction became significant, suggesting a change shaped less by sudden reaction and more by gradual public recalibration. On the ground, the effect remained consistent. Moments that were structured to feel significant unfolded with minimal disruption to the surrounding city life. Passers-by continued moving through their routines. Conversations carried on without pause. Traffic, noise, and daily rhythm persisted almost unchanged, as though the visit existed parallel to the city rather than within its focus. This quiet reception ultimately became the defining tone of the entire experience. It reinforced a pattern that had begun forming earlier, pointing less to a single moment and more to a broader shift in how the appearance was being received. The absence of reaction became the most telling detail of all, suggesting that in this setting, impact was no longer measured by presence alone, but increasingly by what failed to emerge when expectation was at its highest. This subdued reception defined the entire visit, revealing tensions beneath surface appearances. What began as routine appearances quietly exposed deeper resistance, where absence spoke louder than presence and preparation failed to disguise sentiment. When image collided with intention, what truth was truly being hidden now? Let's find out. When image and intention collided. The quiet distance that followed them through Sydney did not ease as the visit continued. Instead, it took on a more complicated tone once their schedule moved into spaces that were meant to inspire empathy and goodwill. Appearances at community locations and charity-focused visits were designed to reconnect and to present a more human and compassionate image. On the surface, these moments carried the weight of purpose. They were carefully arranged, emotionally significant, and closely watched, with each interaction framed to reflect warmth, accessibility, and shared understanding. At the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, the setting shifted from public streets to a place defined by vulnerability and emotional sensitivity. The visit was framed as a meaningful engagement, echoing a legacy of compassion often associated with royal outreach and humanitarian presence. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle met with young patients, spoke briefly with families, and offered words of encouragement that, in the moment, appeared grounded in sincerity. For a short time, the atmosphere softened, shaped by the presence of children whose resilience naturally reframed the space. Cameras captured smiles, gestures, and moments of connection that seemed to align with the intended purpose of the visit. Yet even within that environment, subtle questions began to surface. Observers noted how structured the engagement appeared, how tightly each segment of the visit seemed to transition into the next. There was little room for spontaneity, and every interaction appeared to unfold within carefully managed timing. Soon after, attention shifted away from the emotional core of the hospital visit toward peripheral details that, under different circumstances, might have remained unnoticed. The clothing worn during the engagement, elegant, polished, and deliberately styled, appeared online for purchase shortly after the visit concluded. What once would have been dismissed as coincidence now became part of a growing pattern of scrutiny. That pattern did not remain confined to a single location. At Bondi Beach, during a visit tied to the aftermath of a tragic December 2025 attack, the tone was expected to be solemn and reflective. The shoreline, already carrying emotional weight for the community, had become a place of mourning and remembrance. Survivors, first responders, and local residents gathered in an atmosphere shaped by loss and resilience. The presence of public figures in such a space was intended to signal solidarity and quiet support rather than visibility or presentation. Once again, however, timing and presentation drew attention beyond the immediate moment. The outfit worn during the visit reportedly became available for purchase online shortly afterward, reinforcing questions that had already begun circulating. The contrast between the emotional gravity of the setting and the commercial availability of associated fashion elements created a tension that many found difficult to overlook. What had been intended as a gesture of respect and presence instead became part of a broader discussion about optics, intent, and interpretation. As these details circulated across public platforms and media commentary, the tone of reaction began to shift. Earlier responses had been largely observational, marked by distance and restraint. Now, that restraint gave way to closer examination. Audiences began to revisit each appearance, replaying moments, analyzing timelines, and comparing presentation with context. The narrative no longer rested solely on what was said or done in the moment, but on what followed immediately after. What had been structured as a sequence of meaningful engagements began to accumulate additional weight. Each appearance seemed to exist on two parallel levels: the intended message delivered in real time, and the secondary narrative formed in its aftermath. The space between those two interpretations grew wider with each event, raising a persistent question that lingered beyond the carefully constructed scenes. Where does intention end and perception truly begin? Weeks of planned appearances began to shift in meaning, as every meeting and gesture took on unexpected weight beyond intention. Perception started to overpower reality, widening a gap that no one could easily close. But what unseen force was shaping these moments behind the scenes? Keep watching. Small moments that spoke volumes. As questions began to build around their appearances, it was not the formal events or planned speeches that captured the world's attention. Instead, it was a series of brief, almost ordinary moments that unfolded without warning and quickly took on a life of their own. These moments were not staged or carefully managed. They were spontaneous, subtle, and, in many ways, far more revealing than anything that had been scheduled. At Bondi Beach, during a visit connected to the aftermath of the December 2025 attack, the setting appeared calm and open. The shoreline stretched wide, with only scattered groups of people enjoying the day. As Prince Harry and Meghan Markle moved along the sand with their team, one unexpected detail drew attention. A woman lay on the beach, resting quietly, seemingly undisturbed by the approaching group. There was ample space around her, enough for anyone to easily walk a different path. Yet the movement continued directly past her, close enough to make the moment feel unusually personal. What stood out was not just the path taken, but the reaction that followed. The woman did not move. She did not look up, did not shift, did not acknowledge the presence passing by. In that brief interaction, or lack of it, something deeper seemed to surface. It was not confrontational. It was not dramatic. It was simply a quiet refusal to engage. That stillness, captured on camera, quickly became symbolic of a wider sentiment. Not long after, another moment began to circulate. This time it involved a child. In a nearby setting, a young girl sat with a sketchbook, focused on her drawing. As Meghan Markle approached and leaned in, the interaction appeared gentle at first, but the child's response was immediate and instinctive. She pulled her sketchbook closer, closed it, and held it protectively against herself. There was no scene, no visible distress, just a clear and quiet boundary. These moments might have passed unnoticed in another context, but within the atmosphere that had already begun to form, they carried a different weight. They were shared widely across social media, viewed from countless angles, and discussed in ways that extended far beyond their simplicity. Each clip, each image, became part of a larger narrative that people were beginning to piece together. Online reactions grew rapidly. Viewers paused, replayed, and interpreted what they saw. The beach moment was described as a symbol of indifference. The child's reaction was seen as instinctive and telling. Whether these interpretations were entirely fair or not, they gained momentum, shaping how the visit was being understood around the world. What made these moments so powerful was their authenticity. They were not filtered through official messaging or controlled environments. They unfolded naturally, leaving room for interpretation, but also leaving a strong impression. In a visit already marked by quiet distance and growing scrutiny, these small, unscripted interactions became defining images, turning brief seconds into lasting symbols that continued to echo far beyond the shores where they first occurred. Unscripted, authentic moments broke through controlled narratives, leaving powerful images that lingered beyond a visit marked by distance and scrutiny. But what if these fleeting seconds were only the surface of something far more significant unfolding beneath the numbers? And what do they truly reveal? Stay with us. When the numbers told a different story. As the images from Bondi Beach and the quiet viral moments continued to circulate, attention began to shift towards something far more concrete. Beyond perception and interpretation, there were numbers, clear, measurable figures that offered a different way of understanding what had unfolded. And in many ways, those numbers carried a weight that no single moment could fully capture. During the same period in Australia, another public event was taking place. This one, however, followed a very different pattern. Pamela Anderson hosted an appearance that drew a crowd of around 2,000 people. The ticket price was modest, set at approximately $85. The turnout was strong, the energy was visible, and the response was immediate. People showed up in large numbers, creating the kind of atmosphere that naturally signals interest and engagement. Placed alongside this, the contrast became difficult to ignore. The Sydney retreat featuring Meghan Markle had carried a significantly higher price point, reaching over $3,000 Australian dollars for premium access. Yet the number of attendees remained strikingly low, with only a small group filling a space that had been prepared for many more. The difference was not subtle. It was sharp, almost uncomfortable in its clarity. This comparison began to circulate widely, not as an isolated statistic, but as part of a broader conversation. It raised a question that could no longer be easily dismissed. Was public interest simply declining, or was it changing into something else entirely? The answer did not seem straightforward. There was still attention, still discussion, still a level of global focus, but attention alone did not translate into presence. It did not guarantee participation. For Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, this distinction became increasingly important. Their presence continued to attract headlines and online engagement, yet the physical response on the ground told a more complicated story. The willingness of people to attend, to invest time and money, appeared to be shifting. What had once been a reliable draw no longer seemed as certain. Observers began to interpret these figures as more than just numbers. They became indicators of perception. The gap between price and attendance suggested a growing hesitation. It hinted at a change in how value was being placed on these appearances. The exclusivity that had once been appealing now raised questions about accessibility and relevance. This moment began to feel like a turning point. Not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet adjustment in how the public was responding. The contrast between events, the difference in turnout, and the discussions that followed all pointed toward a shift that was still unfolding. It was not defined by a single cause or a single moment, but by a pattern that was becoming harder to overlook. As the conversation continued, the numbers remained at the center, offering a clear, unfiltered perspective. They did not rely on interpretation or opinion. They simply reflected what had happened, and in doing so, they added a new layer to the story, one that suggested the changes taking place might extend far beyond this single visit. As the conversation unfolded, the numbers stayed at the center, offering an unfiltered account untouched by opinion, quietly revealing changes that may reach far beyond a single visit, reshaping the narrative in ways no one expected. So what else are these numbers really pointing toward now? Echoes that reached far beyond the shore. As the numbers settled and the comparisons continued to circulate, the impact of the Australia visit began to stretch far beyond the country itself. What had unfolded was no longer being viewed as a single trip with a few missteps. It started to take shape as something more symbolic, a moment that reflected a broader shift in how Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were being seen on the global stage. International coverage picked up quickly. Headlines focused not only on the quiet crowds or the uneven reception, but on what those details might represent. The conversation moved from isolated incidents to wider questions about public perception, influence, and long-term relevance. The images from Sydney, the moments from Bondi Beach, and the numbers tied to the retreat all became part of a larger narrative that was now being examined from multiple angles. What made this shift more significant was the consistency of the signals. It was not just one event or one reaction. It was a series of moments that, when viewed together, suggested a pattern. The absence of large crowds, the mixed response to public appearances, and the growing scrutiny online all pointed toward a change that was becoming harder to ignore. The visit began to represent more than its original purpose. It became a reference point. At the same time, attention turned quietly toward developments within royal circles. While much of this remained private and carefully managed, there were increasing indications of distance. Discussions in public forums and media commentary hinted at a relationship that had grown more complex over time. References to Prince William began to appear more frequently, often framed around a sense of separation rather than connection. The tone of these conversations was measured, but the underlying message was clear. The gap between the brothers had not narrowed. This added another layer to the unfolding story. The events in Australia were no longer being viewed in isolation. They were being linked, directly or indirectly, to a wider context that included family dynamics, public expectations, and the evolving role of the couple outside traditional royal structures. Each element reinforced the others, creating a more complex picture. For observers, the question was no longer simply about how the trip had gone, it was about what it revealed. The visit had highlighted contrasts between expectation and reality, between image and response, and between attention and engagement. These contrasts began to shape how future appearances might be perceived, not just in Australia, but elsewhere. The tension that had quietly built from the beginning of the visit now carried a different weight. It was no longer limited to moments of silence or scattered reactions. It extended into reputation, into relationships, and into the broader narrative surrounding their public role. What had started as a carefully planned series of appearances had gradually transformed into something far more revealing, raising questions that would continue to follow them long after the trip itself had come to an end. So, what do you think silence really revealed here? Was it a fading influence, a shifting public mood, or something deeper within Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's story? We'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.